This presentation is about slavery in the agricultural villages of Norfolk County, Massachusetts. This is a headstone in Medfield. It says in memory of Mr. Peter Warren, who died January 9th, 1814, aged about 70 years. And then down here it says, a respectable man of color. He had been an enslaved man. You don't find a lot of headstones of people of color here in Norfolk County. So I first became interested in studying slavery when my church asked me to research an enslaved man that lived here in Walpole. It was an interesting research project, but typically once I answer one question, I have 20 more I need to answer. So I found out through a lot of research that's been done on slavery in Boston, but not out in the countryside, like in Dedham or Walpole. I did a lot of reading on this subject, and a lot has been published, but the one thing that stood out to me in the newer books were the scholarly historians studied individual enslaved people, but they tended to mention the same person over and over and over again. And I just figured it was kind of easy to find. This historian mentioned this guy, so I can mention this guy, or I know where to look for his information. And so through this study of mine, I actually went about trying to find people who lived out here who were enslaved, and that's not easy. I'm a genealogist and a historian, and I really wanted to find these people so that I could tell their stories. Very often when we open a history book about Walpole, we'll hear about Isaac Newton Lewis, and we'll hear about the Fales family, and we'll hear about the Claps, but we don't hear about people that lived in our communities that were of the labor class, and it's because they worked here. They worked in the fields and farms, and they didn't leave a lot of information behind. I would like to tell you a little bit about the history of slavery here in Massachusetts. In the 1600s, Europeans had established colonies up and down the Atlantic coast, and they all practiced slavery. Today, many people are often surprised to hear that at one time, Massachusetts residents could legally own slaves. In fact, my son has a friend over tonight at my house, and I was studying my notes and said, well, I'm going to the library and I'm giving this presentation about slavery in Norfolk County. He's like, what? It was news to him. So the earliest recording of Negroes arriving in Boston was in 1638. Now, Boston was settled in 1630. So within 8 years, the English began importing people to enslave. This practice remained acceptable in the Commonwealth until 1738 with a judicial declaration that the Massachusetts Constitution did not support slavery. Compared to other states, people of color, both enslaved and freed, were a small percent of Massachusetts' population. Most lived in port towns where their labor was needed on the waterfront. As I mentioned, quite a bit of information is easily found and has been previously researched on people who lived in these large towns, like Boston and Salem, and less known is known about enslavers out here, like in Dedham. But they were needed, so we often think about slavery in agricultural areas, like large southern plantations that relied on so many enslaved people to work in their fields. And we know that we did not have similar plantations here in Massachusetts. And in fact, if you've ever tried to plant a tomato in your backyard, it's not easy. That's a very rocky, sandy soil. So why were enslaved people needed in a remote countryside village like Dedham or Walpole that were basically agricultural communities? So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the timeline of slavery in Massachusetts. In the 1620s, the Pilgrims established Plymouth Colony. 10 years later, in 1630, the Puritans established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1636, Dedham is settled. So 6 years later, Dedham was settled by people who came from Watertown, and they paddled up the Charles River in a canoe. Between 1636 and 1638, not long after these settlements were formed, the colonists began enslaving New England's indigenous people. Many native people were captured during the Pequot War and then transported to the West Indies, and others were forced to work locally. Their labor was needed locally. The only problem with that was they knew how to get home. And so very often they just left where they were being enslaved. And so the English were very ingenious, and they just decided to take all of our New England indigenous people and send them to like the West Indies, Barbados. In 1638, the first people of color arrived in Boston. In 1641, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the first colony to adopt a law called the Bodies of Liberties, and in it, it legalized slavery. 2 years later, the Bodies of Liberty became an article within the Articles of the New England Confederation, and thus it legalized slavery throughout New England. In 1644, the triangle trade begins, and slave labor was needed on the waterfront. So this is a little map of the triangle trade. So here in New England, we made rum, and we shipped our rum to Europe and to Africa and sold it. And then down in Africa, we picked up African people and we brought them to the sugar plantations, either in the Caribbean or in United States southern plantations. And there we picked up sugar, and the sugar came to New England and we picked up molasses, and molasses was turned into rum. So it was rum was sold, slaves were picked up, or people were picked up and then enslaved, and the sugar plantation, sugar was picked up and came to New England in the form of molasses and made into rum. So that is called the triangle trade today. By the early 1700s, a variety of laws were passed to restrict the movements of people of color. For instance, in 1703, they could not be out after dark. They also required a slave owner who wanted to emancipate one of his slaves, and it was usually because they were too old to work and he didn't want to take care of someone that was going to be a financial burden. He would say, "You're free." And then the burden became the city had to take care of that person. So Massachusetts passed a law that made it, if you wanted to free someone that you had enslaved, you needed to pay a bond of 50 pounds, which is quite a bit of money. And that way, if that person became a charge on the town, there had been money already set aside to help take care of that person. In 1705, interracial marriages were illegal. In 1728, a law was established that prohibited people of color from carrying sticks and canes because they thought they could use them as a weapon. Between 1760 and 1775, we start to see freedom cases coming to light. If you were enslaved, you were still allowed to access our Massachusetts courts. So you had some sort of legal footing. And very often, some people of color who'd been enslaved sued for their freedom. So perhaps their enslaver had said, "Oh, when you turn 18, I'll free you," or if you do this, if you work for me for so long, then I'll free you. And then when it was time for the enslaver to make good on the promise, they reneged. And so they started to, so these people were able to have, take their enslavers to court and sue for their freedom. And I would say mixed results. Some people won their freedom, some people did not. But what's actually interesting is in a lot of the books that I've read, or earlier on, they say, about 17 cases. And one time I thought, I'm going to write them all down. And then I'm going to look at them, 17 cases. And I kept writing and writing, and I got into 2025, and it was clear to me that there was more than 17 cases. And this is a new situation that has been occurring, I would say, within the last 5 to 10 years. Local historians are going into courts and pulling court cases and going through them individually to locate these freedom cases, and we're seeing that there was a lot more than just a handful that had occurred during this time. In fact, I wrote this in January. I date everything. And within the last several months, several books have come out saying that this was a time of black activism. And that, so a lot of changes and thought processes are changing amongst scholarly historians. So after 1780, which was the end of the Revolutionary War, 3 freedom cases came about that changed how Massachusetts legally viewed slavery. These people sued for their freedom using the recently written, ratified Massachusetts Constitution, which includes a Declaration of Rights that stated, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned with the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, and that of acquiring, possessing, protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. So this woman here, Mum Bet, who took the name Elizabeth Freeman once she was freed, sued her in the Massachusetts court saying, this statement right here says, in Massachusetts, everybody is born free and equal. That's me. I deserve these rights that everybody else has. And she won. And then another case came up behind it. They're referred to as the Quock-Walker cases. There's about 5 of them that started. I could do a whole talk just on that. But it ended up, these cases ended up with one case, so they kind of funneled down into one case. And what happened was Quock's enslaver he was helping a neighbor. He dragged him home, locked him in the barn, and beat him. And he said, hey, I'm a free man. You can't do that to a free man. And that case so Quock was deemed that he was free. And he was deemed free because the enslaver didn't come to court. And he said, hey, I didn't get the memo. You know, this guy is still my servant and not a free person. And so it went up to the Massachusetts Judicial Court, Supreme Court, and was decided by Chief Justice William Cushing, who himself was an enslaver. In this case, the Commonwealth versus Jennison, Judge Cushing said to the jury, slavery, in my judgment, is effectively abolished, as it can be, by granting the rights and privileges in our Constitution, wholly and incompatible and repugnant with its existence, slavery. He's insinuating in this document that people living in Massachusetts were considered free per the state constitution. But this was never an official declaration. People don't point to this as a legal thing, like, hey, that judge said that, so I'm free. He was telling the jury that was going to be deciding whether Jennison had held Quock-Walker against his will and had beaten him. And so he was pointing out that it was already decided that Quock-Walker was free. That's not what you're deciding. You're deciding if Jennison was abusive. And the court went through and found that Jennison was indeed abusive to Quock-Walker. And after that, Quock-Walker was officially free. However, this moment in time doesn't necessarily mean that all enslaved people in Massachusetts were immediately emancipated. Many unscrupulous owners held this information from their enslaved people, hoping to get as much free labor out of them before they found out about this. And then some owners quickly sold off their enslaved people to states and countries where slavery was still legal before they found out. I think these are the censuses. This is the 1790 census. So our Revolutionary War ended in 1780. In 1783, these cases made their way through the courts. And at that point, Massachusetts was considered a free state. And so 1790 was our first federal census. And this is the total of numbers taken. And you'll see here in the column where it says slaves, Massachusetts, and Maine, it says none. And at that time, Maine was the District of Maine, and it was part of Massachusetts. And then very low numbers of other states. Well, Connecticut, they continued to practice slavery for many years. But today, many historians agree that slavery actually ended gradually. So now that you have all that background information, there's no quiz at the end, don't worry. I want to talk to you about Mother Dedham. This is all of the original land that was granted to the town of Dedham. And then over years, pieces of it were set off. So 1636, this was all of Dedham. 1650, 2,000 acres, we call it Natick, was given away to the Praying Indians. A year later, Medfield was set off. They're gearing up for their 350th anniversary next year. Wrentham was set off in 1673, and at that time it included Franklin, Norfolk, and Plainville. Needham was set off in 1711, and then Wellesley was a chunk of that. It was set off in 1881. Bellingham was set off in 1719, 1724. Of course, we just had our anniversary. Walpole was set off. And what is today Norwood and Westwood wanted to set off to be their own town, but they got a little fight. So the people of the third parish said, yeah, we don't want to go. We'll stay in Dedham. And it was decided that instead of a new town being established, that South Dedham would be a parish of Dedham. So in 1783, it became Norwood. The West Dedham parish is now Westwood. And in 1748, the fourth parish was established, Springfield Parish. And it became Dover in 1836. So these are the communities that I was looking at for this study. We all have very similar land. We are mostly agricultural communities. The towns were small villages. Even Dedham was a relatively small village. So people of color who were living in Norfolk County per the censuses, you can just look that there was a census done in 1754. It was a slave census that was ordered that every town should count how many people were enslaved, but it meant people only over 16. So it didn't include children and teenagers, and it likely didn't include really elderly people who couldn't really work. And then the 1765 census, they counted males and females and Indians. Oh, and also French Acadians. We had a couple of French Acadians that escaped, were taken from Canada, and they were kept here in Walpole. One of them is buried in our old cemetery. But the city of Boston was reimbursing towns for their expenses for caring for these people. In 1771, an inventory was taken for a lot of things, but there was a column set aside for servants for life. And in the 1790 census, all other people. So you can see that there's a slight fluctuation here in terms of numbers, but overall, it's relatively small number of people. So looking at slavery in the towns, these are the big towns. And I've highlighted Boston, Salem, Scituate, and Dartmouth. And Dartmouth also included New Bedford and Westport and Acushnet. And so this number here is then also broken out, these numbers to here. So 34, 37, 176. So these towns were city towns. They were towns that were along the wharfs. They were involved in shipping and shipbuilding, and they needed labor to help them with that. And you'll see that some places counted males and females, and you see, like in Boston, a larger number of males, both in 1754 and in 1765, and that's because we needed them on the waterfront. We didn't need as much women. So you get an idea that, you know, a city out here might have had 5 enslaved people in town, and in Boston, Salem, Scituate, and in Dartmouth, they had much larger numbers. And actually, those numbers, I followed them, really switched after 1783. So the forgotten history of slavery here in Norfolk County. So when I first started my search, I used the terms, I have to do air quotes, slavery in Walpole, slavery in Medfield, to see what I could find. And a lot more towns today, so if you go home and do a Google search, you'll probably find more information. But Medfield was on the Underground Railroad, so they have a big article about the Underground Railroad. In Dedham, you find this man, William Gould, who was born into slavery in the South, and he escaped in 1862. He was in the Civil War, and he came to Dedham. And 2023, they erected a statue in his honor. But when you do slavery in Dedham, this is what you find. You find the story of William Gould. And then Needham Historical Society, this is its presentation on slavery. I think I snapped that from YouTube. But Needham has begun to research their history in slavery as well. So I needed to locate people who were enslaved, because you couldn't just find a list of names. I have made one for you. And so that meant that I needed to figure out who was rich enough to be an enslaver. And that would be a minister. Minister is one of the wealthiest people in town. Tavern owners, small business owners, and perhaps someone that had a large piece of land, a large farm. I started digging through church records, and I dug through probate records. So if I found like Nathaniel Ames, I found out when he died, I would go and I would pull his will, and I would read the inventory. Did he own an enslaved person that he left to someone? And so these are 45 enslaved or formerly enslaved people in Dedham that I found to date. Others may appear in newspapers and military records, but I found a record in church records for marriages and deaths and baptisms, and then in probate records, I found the list of these people. And I think, other than 1691, we're going to see, again, more people in the 1650s and 60s. So slavery I think I've got, wait a minute, I might be getting ahead of myself. What were the lives like of the people who lived in the countryside? So for enslaved people, it was generally accepted that they lived in the home with the people that were enslaving them. They took their meals with them. They slept perhaps in an attic room. They would have worked on the family's farm or helped out with household chores. And if the enslaver owned a business, such as a tavern or a store or a smithy, the enslaved person likely worked in the business. Some enslaved people were repeatedly sold and resold. Perhaps that was because at the time of purchase, their skill was needed by a particular person, and then once the skill was no longer needed, they sold them. It was a commodity. They were commodities. So other enslaved people seem to have spent the bulk of their lives with one family. Colonial society had laws and regulations in place, making it hard for people of color to make their own choices. Massachusetts had laws regarding slaves, what an individual enslaved person could or could not do. For instance, an enslaved person needed permission from their enslaver to marry. Often married couples did not live together. They continued to live with their enslavers. Children born became the property of the mother's enslaver. But very often, with another mouth to feed, they were seen as a financial problem, and so children were given away. One of the earliest historians in 1795, it was Jeremy Belknap. He founded the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. He was a minister and he was a historian. And his quote, which is used an awful lot, is, "They were given away like puppies," which also kind of shows how callous the enslavers thought of their enslaved. So enslaved Massachusetts had the freedom to travel from town to town, usually to run an errand for their enslavers, but they could also access the courts, as we mentioned before. We know that most enslaved or formerly enslaved people who lived in the countryside were physical laborers. Very few were trained artisans. For those that had a skill experienced some sort of economic success after they were freed. And those who worked as laborers had a harder time finding work and often ended up on the poor rolls. There was a third category that I found where they continued to live and be cared for by their enslavers, which is interesting, I found as an interesting thing. They did remain. But did they remain enslaved, or did they have the freedom to choose to stay with their enslavers, perhaps continuing to work for them in exchange for room and board? So their life didn't change anything. They still had their jobs to do because the poorhouse was really a terrible option. So understanding poor laws here in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, if you were poor, so I grew up in Wellesley, I consider myself a Wesleyan. If I became a financial problem to the town of Walpole, they would send me to Wellesley. I was Wellesley's problem, even though I've lived here. My children are born and raised Walpoleans. If I'm in financial trouble, they'll take care of my children. This one here, in going through Walpole's old records, I find particularly poignant. Deborah Chamberlain, she signed with an X, so she didn't read or write. Her husband was killed in the Revolutionary War. She was his second wife. His older children got the property because he died without a will, and it doesn't even look like she got her widow's portion. She had two small children. She was from West Roxbury, but her children were Walpole kids. And so she approached the town, and it says here, "This may inform the honorable selectmen in the district. In a difficult time, I cannot provide for myself and two children, and I should be glad that your honor would take their care and place out my two children in good places." Her children are Isaac and Moses. Her children stayed here in Walpole. They were 5 and 3 years old. She likely went back to West Roxbury, which is where she was from, and her children stayed here in town. Her son Moses is buried at Rural Cemetery. And Isaac, I don't know how he ended up in Dedham, but he is buried at the Old Parish Cemetery in Norwood. But this was not unusual. This is how we handled the poor. Every year, the town of Walpole would say, all right, we have 6, 7, 20 people that need to be taken care of. And the town would put out for a bid, basically. And I have an extra bedroom at home. So I might say, well, I can take someone for $2 or £2 a month. And the lowest bidder would get someone that they would take care of. And so these children would have gone out to bid. They may not have stayed together in a home. They might have been separated. And obviously, a 5-year-old, you might be able to get a 5-year-old to do some chores, but a 2-year-old is a baby and needs to be taken care of. What's different is people who were enslaved. So someone might have been born to an enslaved woman in Wrentham and was sold to someone in Dedham and then to Medway and ended up in Medfield when they were freed. At that time, that their freedom, the town where they were freed is the town that would take care of them. That's where they belonged. They belonged to that town. There are different laws pertaining to who you are and how you're taken care of when you're poor.
These two laws exist?
These poor laws, no. We have some social networks. We have Social Security, so up until the 30s, we elderly folk worked until we died. The concept of retirement was new. FDR gave that to us. So if you're retired, you can thank FDR. FDR also had a lot of other social nets that were put out there. And up until the 1930s, the town still pretty much took care of their people. I did a thing for the Norfolk Historical Society on the printing industry in Norwood, and that brought with it the hospital, which we all wish was back again. It brought so about 1900, we call it the progressive era. And in the progressive era, we start to see things shorten work days. Children don't work. There are hospitals. There are ways for you to access some form of health care. There were a lot of social clubs in Walpole. So like there was a German club. The building is still there on Wilson Street up near where I live. It was, you pay when you belonged, you gave some money in, and if one of your German neighbors was in need of something, there was some money that this club had set aside specifically to help people. So the help that the towns took care of their poor, the people took care of their poor. Obviously, if it was your parent, they were in your home until they died. It all sort of changed in the late 1930s with FDR, and have what we have today. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the people I kind of met along the way. Caesar Celler was a plane maker. He lived in Wrentham. When his enslaver, Francis Nicholson, died, he had trained Caesar as a plane maker. To my Negro man, Caesar Celler, answering his faithful service and tender care and kind and Christian carriage, I do set him free to act for himself in the world, and I will and bequeath unto him his bed and bedding, his clothing, his bench and common bench. He gave him all his tools and a set of chisels, one young vice, gave him all his tools. And I think he also gave him, common right, I know it's in here, he gave him some land too. So basically, he trained this man while he was enslaved him as a plane maker. And when he died, he freed him. He gave him some clothes, he gave him his tools, and he gave him some land. Caesar was able to take care of himself and his family. His planes today are around, they are quite expensive. They are valued at well over $2,000. They're considered some of the best planes that were ever made. Let's see. What I found was people who'd been enslaved, who had training, were able to find jobs and support themselves and their families once they were free. So this is the story of Newport Green. That's his death record. He was enslaved by a man named Moses Hartshorn, who, I live in his brother's house, here in Walpole. Moses was a Walpole kid. He was a blacksmith, and he horribly treated Newport, so much so that the people in the town of Medfield took up a collection and purchased his freedom. So Newport went on. He fought in the Revolutionary War for the town of Medfield, but he was trained as a nailer. He made nails. He moved to Natick and lived just over the border, like on the edge of where Wellesley meets Natick, and at that time that was Needham. It doesn't look like he owned a house, but the Natick Historical Society has a receipt for paying him for making the nails for the new South School. Newport was known to take care of those that needed care, so he took in other previously enslaved people into his home and cared for them, gave them a place to live. But then about 1800, a mechanism was invented and nails didn't need to be hammered anymore. They could be made by machinery, and Newport no longer had a job. He had to return to Medfield. That would be the town where he was freed, and he was on their poor rolls. He died in 1816. And his death is noted in Medfield vital records. So it's another man who had a trained profession and was able to support his family and also help out his neighbors until that profession was no longer needed. This is the story of Sambo Freeman. He was in Medway, lived an enslaved man named Sambo. He died in 1797, and a notation was made in town records that he was nearly 80, giving the year of his birth at about 1719. No documentation has been found regarding his early life. We don't know who his parents were, which is the case for most enslaved people. We don't know where he was born. Was he born here in New England, or was he born in Africa and captured as a small child? We know that he was owned by William and Bethiah Burgess of Medway. The first time he appears in records is when his enslaver, William Burgess, brought him to the church in Medway to be baptized in 1739. During his time with the Burgesses, or possibly before, he learned the art of carpentry. He was actually considered a master carpenter, and it was a trade that served him well. In 1754, Sambo's life dramatically changed. In January, William Burgess died, and soon after, his widow sold him to John Adams of Wrentham. And on April 6, 1754, Sambo bought his own freedom. He took the name Freeman, the surname Freedom. He kept his first name, Sambo. Very often, the fellow at the beginning, Peter Warren, he had a different name, and maybe I'll have it written down as we come along. But when he earned his freedom, he totally changed his name, which makes it tricky for finding people, right? So you find them in someone's will listed as Sambo, and then if someone didn't write down the name change, you don't know that you're looking at the same person. Sambo enlisted in Medway's militia sometime around 1758, and so he served in the French and Indian War. And he was still living in Medway in 1762 when he was warned out of town. So he moved to Holliston, which was neighboring to Medway, in 1776, when he filed for his intentions to marry Eleanor, or Nellie Donahue. She was the widow of Cuff Oxford of Framingham. Eleanor brought 4 children to the marriage, and together Sambo and Eleanor had 5 more children. On September 30th, 1797, Sambo died of a fever. He was nearly 80 years old. A year later, in 1798, his wife Eleanor died, as did their youngest child. When Sambo died, he left a sizable estate. He had 18 acres of land with the buildings thereon. Also listed in his inventory was a weaving loom with web and loom and several yards of cloth. People were warned out of town because the town fathers were afraid that they might become a financial drain on the community. It's actually really interesting because in those warnings, sometimes it lists wives and children, and from a researcher and genealogist perspective, look at there's the names of their children. So for me, I might think it's good. For them, they didn't think it was that good. Jack Robbins, he was a laborer. He lived here in Walpole. He lived in Walpole Center and was enslaved by a man named Deacon Ezekiel Robbins. In the Walpole Center was a tavern run by Deacon Ezekiel Robbins, who enslaved a man named Jack. Jack likely arrived in Walpole sometime between 1755 and 1760. We don't know where he was born or when he was born or who his parents were. When Jack arrived in Walpole, Deacon Robbins and his wife would have been in their 60s, and they were childless and they probably needed help to run their large farm. They had over 200 acres of land here in the downtown area, which is a sizable farm. Average size of farm was about 40 to 60 acres, so this was twice the size. Right, yep. So his brother, he grew up on Robbins Road, about where the middle school is, or it's not the middle school anymore, but that's where the house was. It went to his oldest brother, William, and Ezekiel ended up here living in the downtown area. When Ezekiel left his entire estate, both real and personal, to his wife. But upon her death, his land was to be given to the church. And he set out 3 conditions in his 1776 will for the church to follow if they wanted to end up with the land. One was to take tender care of Jack should he become chargeable. So should he become a charge to the town would not pay for his care, the church would. One was to pay a legacy to 2 nieces and nephews. And the third was to support the minister. So in 1783 was a pivotal year for Jack. In February, the widow Robbins died, and the church voted to accept the terms of Deacon Robbins' will. In July, Judge Cushing ordered his directive saying that slavery, in his judgment, was essentially over, according to the Constitution. And in 1787, Jack was living in Attleboro, likely North Attleboro, and where he married a woman named Hannah Easton. She was a free person of color from Norton. Jack and Hannah, they were probably in their 50s and 60s. They didn't have any children. They returned to Walpole around 1789 when the church formed a committee to oversee Jack's care. When Jack and Hannah returned to Walpole, the church became Jack's caretaker. The church and Jack seemed to have a disagreement as to the parameters of the kind of what tender care meant. It seems that Jack thought that care would include a wife, should he have one. First, the church decided to look into the legality of Jack and Hannah's marriage. So, were they really married? And of course, the clerk in Attleboro would have said, yes, they're legally married. So when that wasn't, something they could go with, so because Jack belonged to Walpole and Hannah was his wife, she belonged to Walpole too. So as long as they were legally married, Hannah could live in this community. So they couldn't send her back to Norton. Then the church decided to look at the terms of Deacon Robbins' will, which they decided meant that only Jack and no other wife it was only Jack and no wife or children were to be cared for. Jack attempted to sue the church, likely, over this issue, and he and Hannah moved to Boston for a short while. They never succeeded in getting the church to support Hannah, but the town did. So I see Hannah going out to the community saying, we have this person who can take care of her for the lowest price. This is the church, as it looked in the 1750s. It looks pretty similar today, but it's a nice addition on the back. This is a piece of Deacon Robbins' will regarding the tender care of Jack. This mile marker is in front of our town hall. It is the only thing of Deacon Robbins that we can point to. This would have been out in front of his tavern. It says 20 miles to Boston. And then this was the elopement advertisement that the church took out, making a statement that we take care of Jack, we pay for his stuff. Don't send bills to us because he belongs here in town and we take care of him here in town. Jack died in 1810. It appears that Jack was able to support himself early on. He was living in Attleboro, and I'm assuming, well, he's actually found on a tax roll, so he was paying taxes. He was a laborer, so he was probably finding odd jobs, or maybe he had found long-term care, a position where he could live and work. But when he, and the jobs that he would have done, I mean, I know how I feel at my age, and I didn't do the kind of work that Jack did. So I am sure hard labor really wore at his bones and his joints, and so he was probably in his 60s when he came back to Walpole. So the next person I'd like to tell you about is Jack Garish. Jack was a popular name for an enslaved person. He lived in Dedham. Historian Christine Gray Mullen has done extensive research on Jack Garish and his family, and it is due to this research that we can tell the life of Jack when he was enslaved. I found a lot about what happened after he was enslaved. So Jack was born in 1744 in Dedham. But who Jack's parents were is not known, which seems to be the story for most people. In records, he is consistently called a mulatto, it's believed he might have been of indigenous and African ancestry. He was sold to several local families, but by 1757, Nathaniel Ames I purchased him. Ames owned a large estate and was a successful printer and tavern keeper. Jack was listed in Ames's 1764 estate inventory of being about 20 years old, and was assessed at that time of being worth 60 pounds. In 1767, he was sold to the Hoare family, which was a Dedham family, but they were living in Westminster. He ran away from this family in 1770. In an advertisement, he was described as being, let's see, here it is, Daniel Hoare of Westminster, a Negro fellow named Jack, almost about 22 years of age, walks very upright and is about 6 feet high, very black, and had with him 3 suits of clothes, a fiddle, and some other articles, which tells us a lot about Jack, right? We know he's 6 feet, and he could play the fiddle, which meant he probably not only was cleaning up, perhaps cooking for people in Ames's tavern and in the Hoare tavern, but he also entertained them as well. Jack married around 1785, and I've got here, his marriage was not recorded. I was doing some genealogical research for Annie LePage, who is on our board of directors, and was going through page by page by page of church records that are on FamilySearch.org, and I found Jack's marriage. I nearly fell off my seat. So now my paper says here, we don't know where they got married, it wasn't recorded, and we don't know what Anna's maiden name was or if she had one. She did. Her name was Anna Butler, and they married in Mount Desert Isle in Maine. Their first child was born there, however, which is Chloe. And their other children were born here in Dedham. And they're listed in the Dedham Vital Records. We do not know about Jack through Dedham's, the births of his children, and his death appears in the records. When Jack died, the town noted that he'd been living in the workhouse. It is highly likely he found unskilled labor jobs. For instance, when the new Boston-Providence Highway was constructed in 1803, Jack found work building the new road. As Jack aged, he had a harder time finding jobs and eventually becoming one of Dedham's poor. Jack died in 1817. Although they seem to have grown up poor, Jack and Anna's children appear to have been more financially stable as adults. And the other thing that I found interesting is enslaved people were given certain names. Jack, women were named after flora and faunas, plants. They also used Greek and Roman names. And so, but then I find that when they married, They gave their children English names. So here they named their child Chloe, Charles, Susan, and Makepeace. And I went off on that Makepeace thinking that was a clue. So this group of formerly enslaved people, Jack and Jack, were people who, so Jack Robbins, Jack Garish, they experienced very different kinds of freedom after 1783. Then Caesar, Newport, and Sambo. In the end, they and their family members were all supported by the town in which they belonged, or by some designated guardian. These men had the freedom to support themselves while they were still young enough to find work, but as they aged, it was likely they couldn't find work and support themselves, and they became chargeable to the town. So the final group I'd like to tell you about are people who are formerly enslaved, but who remained with their enslavers. So Flora and London, records in Medway show that Reverend Nathan Bucknam was one of the earliest slave holders. I'm going to watch the time. So he had, in 1738, there's a record of him selling a Negro boy, London, to Jasper Adams for 140 pounds. So he was young and hale and hearty at that time. Adams died 4 years later, and his assets were divided into 4 quarters and shared amongst his siblings, and London ended up with his brother. In an inventory of Jasper Adams, it was actually his nephew, he has his executor of his estate. It appears he ended up with London. Although London died after 1783, when it was deemed slavery was unconstitutional in Massachusetts, the notion in the town records is that London was a Negro manservant of Captain Jonathan Adams. So here, Medway Vital Records, entries for Negroes, etc. Flora, a Negro woman of Nathan Bucknam, died after. London, a Negro servant of Captain Jonathan Adams, died in 1792. And Tony, a Negro of Lieutenant Bullard, well, that was way back when. But the decision hadn't been made yet in 1793. They're making a notation of who those people belong to, indicating that they may still have been enslaved. Bucknam had an enslaved woman named Flora. He was paid for 9 shillings and 4 pence for several years for having his Negro woman keeping the meeting house. So she cleaned up after services. And when he wrote his will in 1789, 6 years after slavery, after slavery was deemed unconstitutional, he wanted, quote, my Negro woman to serve her mistress, his wife, during her natural life. He then added that should Flora outlive him and his wife, she could choose to live with one of his children, and that they would receive an allowance for her care, and that she was not to be expected to work for her, for whoever she lived with. Flora didn't live long enough to have this retirement. She died in 1792, and her master and her mistress actually outlived her. The Reverend died in 1795, and his wife a year later in 1796. So it's clear that Flora and London remained with their enslavers, whether by choice or by coercion, we'll never know. But looking at the lives of London and Flora after 1783, they were both reliant on their enslavers for support. But had they left their enslavers' homes, they most surely would have ended up in the poorhouse. Flora and London remained dependent on others to support them, making it difficult for us today to figure out if they made their own choices, they had choices regarding their freedom. So these case studies illustrate what life was like for formerly enslaved and enslaved people who lived in agricultural communities outside of Boston. The Smithsonian online exhibit defines freedom for an enslaved person as the hope of self-determination, educational opportunities, and full rights of citizenship. This definition is a good metric in which to look at these lives of formerly enslaved people to determine if what their freedom status was. The reality was was that people of color lived on the margins of society. They were expected to follow Massachusetts' early slave codes and like adhering to a curfew. They were expected to pay taxes, but they could not vote. In Medway, London and Flora were relegated to sit in designated pews in the church with other people of color. The state poor laws made it impossible for people of color to relocate to new towns. They most likely had a difficult time securing employment, especially if all they could offer was unskilled labor. If they could not support themselves, then they likely would become chargeable, ultimately ending up on the town's poor rolls, where they would have not had many opportunities to make their own choices. So the question is, did Jack Garish, Flora, Jack Robbins, and London have these freedoms? And what about Caesar Cheller, Newport Green, and Sambo Freeman? All seem to have experienced a more prosperous kind of freedom, as they were able to buy property, or they had it left to them, and they had a skill. Jack Garish appears to have struggled to support himself and his family. Jack Robbins ended up a ward of the church, and both Flora and London never left the care of their enslavers. All subjects and or their families noted in this study experienced some level of unfreedom. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes?
Any of the kids able to go to school? Any of their children?
I don't know. So we know that Jack Garish had children. And in fact, I will tell you, if you're ever researching your family, never give up. You put it on a shelf, and you never know what'll happen. I had done this study during COVID and slightly thereafter, and set it aside when my husband was ill, and then picked it up to see what I could find. And I did slavery in Dedham, and the Dedham Historical Society had Christine Gray, I can't remember what her other name is, speaking about Jack Garish, and she'd found all this information, and I was blown away. Jack Garish had children. His daughters, his son, so one daughter never married, and her house stood like across from the Dedham Mall on Route 1, where there's an awful lot of traffic lights. She was on the other side. Her house stood there for many years. She never married, and when she died, her estate, she had assets of $2,000. And she left it all to the family, likely a white family that cared for her, and became like her family, but her nieces and nephews took the will to court and tried to get their hands on that money. I don't know how that was ultimately settled. Charles married and had 2 daughters. And the daughter Chloe married a mulatto man and moved to Vermont, likely because families that they had been associated with and worked for had gone there. And there's a story where her husband was helping to move an elephant. So the circus was in town, and they needed people to help move the circus from point A to point B. And they got to a bridge over a gorge, and they began to start to move the elephant across the bridge, and he freaked out and caused a bit of havoc, and Chloe's husband fell into the gorge. I know, these stories that you find. But Chloe had children, and I think lived a relatively comfortable life in Vermont. So if Jack Garish's children didn't learn to read and write, but their grandchildren most definitely did. Anybody? Yes?
Well, I would follow from that. I would ask the question of, do you know what the laws were about in Massachusetts for educating children? Compulsory education, when did that begin, and was it specified that that black people could or could not, and so on?
Well, I don't think there were laws regarding, like we know in the South, there were laws in the South you couldn't teach an enslaved person, a black person, to read and write. I've never come across a law like that here in Massachusetts. I can tell you that from our founding of Walpole, when the Great and General Court said, yes, you can set off and have a new town, you have to hire a teacher, you have to build a meeting house, and call a minister. That's what they laid out. So in 1724, we were asked to make sure we had a teacher. And I know also in Dedham, they also had teachers. And here in Walpole, they would put out a teacher like they would a poor person. Teacher's coming to town, who can keep him at his house, how much you're gonna charge us. I would say Congregationalists, the Puritans and the Separatists, Pilgrims, felt that it was really important that everybody learn to read. That way they could read the Bible and they could understand what was in the Bible. Up until that time, you were reliant on the clergy to tell you what it said in the Bible. And so, like we know, the Catholic Church put into play, you should eat fish on Sundays, and it wasn't a biblical-based decision, but it was an economic-based decision. The fishermen along the Italian coast were having a hard time financially, and by asking Catholics to eat fish on Friday, helped with the fishing industry. John Calvin and Martin Luther felt that it was really important that people were able to read the Bible and understand what was in the Bible, and that way they could live a more biblically pure life.
But did they include black people or slaves?
Well, they were allowed to go to church, but they had to sit in a special part in the church.
For the education?
I don't know. So, you know, I haven't...
Read anything specific for or against?
No, and I haven't actually, you know, researched that either. So I can't really answer, but I know that we had only a handful of enslaved people here in Walpole, and they were adults. I haven't found for children. So it wasn't an issue here in Walpole. It certainly would have been an issue in Dedham. I should look into their records. Yes?
The cases in the 1700s, I can't remember that lady's name, but that went to, try to get her freedom. Were they represented by anybody? They have to go themselves and try to make their case?
She was. So she was represented by a lawyer named Sedgwick. The Sedgwicks, Kira Sedgwick is a descendant, if you know stars. They lived like in Worcester County. So he took her case, and then he felt it might be strengthened if there was another enslaved person in the area that could say, hey, I want my freedom too on this rule. His name was Brom. He did not have a surname, so the case was brought to the court for Mumbet and Brom, and they were represented by a lawyer. I don't remember his first name, but his last name was Sedgwick.
That's the document she had X'd. He must have created that document.
Yes, yes. And the picture of her was painted by Sedgwick's daughter, I think. So we actually know what Mumbet looked like, which is pretty cool. Any other questions? So how many people knew that slavery was a thing in Massachusetts? Most of you. That's awesome. When I gave this presentation at the Senior Center, they all went, no. So I'm hoping to enlarge this study, include the rest of Norfolk County, which would stretch the study out to, so that would be, the next piece would be the Dedham Grant Town, Dorchester Grant Towns. So I'm taking Dorchester. But I'm looking for towns that are on the waterfront that I can say, oh, here's some enslaved people who lived on the waterfront, and these are the skills they had, and this is how they lived. Yeah, so stay tuned.